Hey fellas, recently, and by that I mean ever since building 1-2 Switch, I've become more dissatisfied with Marble It Up's design tools, both those that come packaged with Unity and the ones offered by the devs. Pro Builder lacks any procedural tools beyond basic primitives, the barebone UV tools make texture work an absolute slog, and the limited selection of materials in the official level kit can force you to work blind anytime you want to work with unlisted assets. Using Blender instead greatly improves the geometry and UV workflow, but the process of exporting to Unity, adding materials, and compiling the level makes viewing your level even more of a hassle than it was before. And if you don't have the time or the technical know-how to set up dozens of materials in Blender, this can be a huge deal breaker for any new builder who might want to try creating their geometry with this program. So if you're a level builder, today I'm proud to release something that will sidestep this roadblock completely. This is the Marble Blender Kit, a pack of over 140 materials, nodes, and configs that replicate Marble It Up's in-game look to the best of my ability. Surfaces reflect the skybox accurately. Tiles have random variation in color. Fills ignore UV mapping and update in real time. Every single unlisted material I've ever considered using in my levels is included with no more guesswork involved. Custom modifiers to make creating terrain as streamlined as possible, and I plan to update this pack alongside the game, plus whatever extra goodies I come up with. Every material is either handmade or procedurally created from scratch within Blender, with not a single asset ripped from the game itself included. You can find the link to download the pack in the description. You can download it for free, but I'll be very grateful for any donation you can send my way. Now, I won't teach you how to use Blender in this video. Here's some channels I recommend for that. But with that said, here's how to set the kit up, plus a demonstration of the benefits of using Blender. Once your download's finished, unpack marbleBlenderKit.zip and put it anywhere on your drive. Open Blender, click File, Open, navigate to your kit installation, and open marblestartup.blend. Click File, Save As, name it after the level you're making, and save a copy wherever it's easy to find. Repeat this setup every time you start a new project. This file contains a default platform, a lighting setup that imitates Unity's defaults, some useful geometry nodes, and a camera that matches the view from the level select screen. It can even export straight into Unity. Just make sure to untick Physical Camera when you do. Now let's set up the materials. Click Edit, Preferences, File Paths, and at the bottom you'll find Asset Libraries. If there isn't one already, add a library, name it Marble It Up, navigate to marbleBlenderKit/materials, and click Accept. While we're here, go to Add-ons, search for Magic UV, and enable it, as it'll prove very handy once we start building. You should already see your asset browser at the bottom, but if you don't, here's how to set it up. Click this icon in the bottom left section and select Asset Browser. Click the drop-down that says Current File and select Marble It Up. Last, click this drop-down in the middle and set it to Link. And you're done, son. Hold Z and switch to Material Preview so we can see what we're doing. In Object Mode, click and drag whatever material you want directly over where you want it, and it'll be applied automatically. When you want to add a different material to specific faces, on the left, click this checkered orb icon, which brings up material properties. In Edit Mode, select the faces you want to change, then click this plus icon to add a new material slot, click Assign, and then switch back to Object Mode and drag the new material right in. Beautiful, with only the caveat that the material probably tiles way too large. So, here's how to unwrap UVs for Marble It Up from scratch. I'll press Shift and A, add a cube, and make it 4 units big. This is the same size as one tile in-game. I'll swap to the UV editing workspace so I can see what I'm doing. Blender's default cube UVs all fit into this framed grid, which is equal to the size of a single trim tile. I need to scale these UVs way up so that the textures can tile properly. First, I'll change the way the faces are organized. Blender has several ways of generating UVs. I'll bring them all up by pressing U. If your geometry is totally aligned to the grid, you can get away with using cube projection, but the most common method is unwrapping. Imagine cutting the shirt you're wearing all along the stitching and laying each piece perfectly flat on a table. Flattening a mesh like this lets 3D engines project 2D images onto 3D geometry. Unwrap will try to emulate this behavior, but it needs to know where to make cuts first. In Edit Mode, I'll select an edge, right-click, and click Mark Seam. This will let Blender know which faces to cut between when it's time to unwrap. If I unwrapped right now, my UVs would end up horribly distorted, and that's because there isn't enough cuts to flatten the mesh without a lot of squashing and stretching. For this example, I'll simply mark every edge on the cube as a seam, turning every face into its own island. Select everything, press U, unwrap, and make sure margin is set to 0. You can see the results in the UV editor, which has stacked every face neatly into a triangle. Now, to scale them up to size using the add-on I had you enable. While everything is still selected, press U, find World Scale UV, and hit Apply Manual. Set everything to 1, and set Origin to a corner. I'll pick left bottom. Hit OK, switch to Object Mode, and apply a material. Now your materials should be scaled properly, relative to the physical size of the mesh. That's all the basics, so now I'll try tackling that halo ring from the beginning of the video, which involves complex geometry, unlisted materials, and dealing with scaling issues on the stones. I'll start by pressing Shift-A, add mesh, and add a circle. I want this ring to be 10 tiles in diameter, with 8 tiles per quarter, and 3 faces per tile. I'll set radius to 21 to account for depth, add 96 vertices, and rotate it vertically. Control-A, apply rotation, always a good habit, and tab into edit mode. 2 to select edges, and A to select everything. This is where Blender's hotkey workflow comes in handy, as it'll let me perform precise operations with exact coordinates, keeping my mesh aligned to the grid. I'll press E to extrude, Y to constrain it to the Y-axis, and 8 to define the width of the extrusion. Now I'll press 3 to select faces, A to select everything, Alt-E, and I'll pick Extrude along normals. Extrude by 1, and press S to enable even thickness, to ensure everything is scaled correctly. With Alt left click, I'll select the face loops along both sides, and repeat the process to add trims. I'll use face orientation to make sure the mesh isn't inside out, and I'll right click the mesh and hit Shade Auto Smooth. This will automatically define smoothing groups on the mesh, which will smooth out shadows and reflections, as well as reduce your file size. If you click this triangle icon here and open up the normals dropdown, you can adjust the minimum angle an edge needs to be considered sharp. You can also select any edges you like, right click, and hit Mark Sharp if you need to override the smoothing. Now switch to Material Preview, and I'll define the materials I want to use. You can see the color is coming through, but there's no texture, and that's because the mesh doesn't have any UVs. The usual unwrap method I've covered so far would capture the sizes and angles of the faces accurately, but to get this to look right, the UVs need to be straight and uniform, as if they were unwrapped from a simple cube. Luckily for us, Blender makes this extremely easy with just a little bit of setup. Swapping to the UV editing workspace, I'll select an edge on the bottom and zoom my camera to it by pressing period on the numpad. I'll select the edge loops I want to cut the UVs on and mark them as seams. Next, I'll select just one column of faces, unwrap them, and set them to world scale. In the UV editor, enable snapping, set it to increment, and turn absolute grid snap on. Alt left click to select the edges, scroll to zoom in, press G, and align the edges to the UV grid. I want a ratio of 3 faces to 1 tile, which means this column is 3/4 the width I want it to be. That measurement won't align to the grid, but thankfully Blender supports math equations within its operations, allowing me to scale this column's width with pinpoint accuracy. To do so, I'll press S, X, / 0.75. 1 divided by 0.75 equals 1 1/3, which is exactly the size I need. Now I'll press Alt left click to select a loop of faces around the ring, and I'll make sure one of the faces I just worked with is selected last, highlighting it with white. Blender considers this face active, and will use it as the reference for the next step. Press U, select Follow Active Quads, and click OK, making everything selected uniform with the active face. Next I'll select absolutely everything while keeping the same face active, and use Follow Active Quads again. If my math from earlier was right, everything will now be tiling seamlessly, except for the stones on the inside. This is because these stones are 4/5 the scale of regular tiles, and so the UVs need to be rescaled to compensate. I'll select the whole face loop, and with my pivot set to 2D cursor, press S and divide by 1.2. If you want to make changes after this, you can do so by scaling these faces up by 1.2, making your adjustment, and then dividing again. From there, select any misaligned faces and move them back into place, and boom! Easily an hour of work in Unity, done flawlessly in just a couple minutes. And this just barely scratches the surface of what Blender is capable of, and any of its wealth of tools can potentially be used in level geometry. As an example, I'll create a smooth slope like the ones you see in Archiarchy. I'll create an 8x8x1 cube, extrude trims, delete the unnecessary faces, unwrap and scale the UVs, assign some materials, and add some loop cuts. Most of the powerful tools within Blender can be found in the Modifiers tab, which is this wrench icon here. There's a large selection of procedural tools that come with Blender, along with the tools to create your own. With my platform selected, I'll click Add Modifier and pick Geometry Nodes. Open this dropdown and pick MIU Simple Slope, which is a modifier that comes with the startup file. There's only one of these right now, but I plan to add more in future updates as I get familiar with geometry nodes. So far, nothing has happened, but dragging the distance slider on the Z-axis will reveal the effect. This makes a slope, but it's going in the wrong direction. The axis parameter aligns the slope on the X, Y, or Z axis. I'll set it to Y, and use invert to flip the slope direction if necessary. Profile switches the slope between 3 different fall-off types, but I'll leave it at 1 for now. And that's it, we're done. And the real power of the modifier stack is just that. They can be stacked on top of each other. Here I've made a long gravity path with a bunch of loop cuts. I'll add a simple deform modifier, set it to twist on the Y-axis, and rotate it by 270 degrees. This is already equivalent to the Helix from Off Kilter, but now I'll add the simple slope and combine it with the twist to smoothly adjust the endpoint. This already unlocks a whole range of possibilities, and because it's all procedural, everything can be reverted to its original form without destroying anything, a state in which UV editing is a piece of cake. I could go on and on and on, but I think I've made my point, so I'll finish up here and get some geometry into Unity. In the outliner window up here, right-click and add a new collection. Put everything you want included in your map into this collection, then double-click it and name it Export. While this collection is selected, go to File, Export, and pick .fbx. Tick on Limit to Active Collection, and while holding Shift, select all of the object types you want to export. I'll select Mesh and Camera. Set these 3 settings to FBX Unit Scale, Z Forward, and Y Up. Navigate to your Unity project and click Export. Now switching over to Unity, navigate to your export folder, drag the new geometry into the scene, and align its position to the grid. Unlike Pro Builder, meshes don't come with collision, so open this new dropdown in the hierarchy, select every mesh in the export, then come down to the inspector, click Add Component, Physics, and find Mesh Collider. You can re-add materials if you need to see what you're doing, but if you click Export right now, everything should show up correctly. From here, add your start and end, level bounds and timing, gems, power-ups, particles, and tunnel animators, etc., all of which is currently done better in Unity than in Blender. And that's about it. If you have any issues, or you think of any features you want to request, please message me, and if you want to keep up to date, subscribe to the channel, because I'll make videos here to detail any future updates. Cheers, fellas!